Hello and welcome back. It is Monday. I am Mr. Sesotris, and this week I'm talking about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is probably one of the most frequently adapted and well-known fictional characters in like pop culture ever. I think Dracula actually has him beat with the number of times that he's been portrayed, but Sherlock Holmes is probably the most famous like human character, so he gets a pass for that. But he's been portrayed by so many different actors like Robert Downey Jr., Johnny Lee Miller. Those are kind of my favorites. Ian McKellen, Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Basil Rathbone, Jeremy Brett, who else? Oh, Benedict Cumberbatch, right? And the characters even influence the way that we talk about media in general. You'll see the terms Watsonian and Doyleist in discussions like in other fandoms. Doyleist is sort of the real world explanation for something, and the Watsonian explanation is sort of the in-universe explanation. If you're looking at, the Star Trek franchise, for example, one really common thing that keeps going along is, why the Klingons look different in the original series to the Next Generation. And so the Watsonian explanation is the in-universe one, and that was given in Star Trek Enterprise, where they show that there was some kind of like genetic virus that got loose and changed a lot of the appearance of certain characters. And then the Doyleist explanation, which is the real world explanation, was that just the budget was microscopic in the 60s. And so when they got into a bigger budget in a later show, they were able to make the characters look more like what they originally intended. So that's kind of that. But getting back to Sherlock Holmes, we have so much material featuring the character, both in like film, TV, even like stories not written by Conan Doyle. And the character has sort of taken on a life of his own. Even in like the really hardcore Sherlock Holmes fandom, where they have their, the game, where, they find like historical references to things that might prove that everything in the Sherlock Holmes canon is real and really happened, and Sherlock Holmes was a real person. And they call it the game because it's sort of this ongoing thing. And some of them take it really, really seriously. Like, this is sort of like fandom to the extreme, to the point where you've got like scholars and historians writing papers about this, trying to prove that kind of, the conceit is that, if you work hard enough, you can prove that this was all real. I don't think a lot of them really believe that it's real, but it's sort of an exercise to kind of see how much of the Holmes stories you can kind of explain away with real events that actually happened. But when you have a character like this that has sort of become so huge, and for a lot of people, their introduction to the character is going to be in other forms of media than, the Arthur Conan Doyle stories and novels. And so, for example, if you have someone whose only exposure to the character is like the TV show Elementary or the show Sherlock, there's kind of this concept floating around of like, well, we don't want to go back to read the original books because, they're kind of outdated and old-fashioned. And, I really like the character when he's like new and modern and set in the modern day. And, that's kind of the way that they want to interact with the character. And that's fine. That's personal preference. That's totally up to them. But if you have this idea that, Sherlock Holmes is sort of quaint and outdated, I want you to get it out of your brain right away. There's a lot of things that was written, 100, 200 years ago that has not aged super well, but I would say Sherlock Holmes is kind of not one of those. Sherlock Holmes has aged really, really well. It's still accessible. It's still fun. It's still really, really cool. And I don't think you should kind of give it a miss. A lot of times when you have, let's say fans of like the show Doctor Who, if they're, eagerly awaiting the next episode featuring the 15th Doctor, and they want to kind of kill time until then watching sort of the original classic series from the 60s onward, they would be like kind of thrown off by sort of the lower production values, the cardboard sets and the clunky line delivery, characters, because they had such limited budget, they couldn't refilm a lot of things. So there's a lot of like flubbed lines that are in the final cut and that kind of thing. And so sometimes people will like not want to watch the original show because they think, oh well, it's old and it's outdated and there's nothing there that's fun. I would also disagree with them. I think classic Doctor Who is wonderful. I especially love the stuff in the 70s, but that's just me. Anyways, don't give up on the original stuff because you think that it's sort of clunky and old-fashioned, because these are such great stories. This collection doesn't have all of them. This is just the ones that were published in Strand magazine. But there's other books like this collection. This is the Study in Scarlet, not a collection, but this is the first novel. And there's other short stories that aren't in this collection that are also, published. I think he spanned everywhere from like, the mid 1800s to like 1927. So there's a long period of time, lots of stories, lots of content, and it is good. Don't ignore it. One thing I will say though, the character of Sherlock Holmes has kind of become something of like a copy of a copy of a copy. A lot of the most modern versions of the character, I'm thinking of like Benedict Cumberbatch or like Hugh Laurie's House from the TV show House, who's also a Sherlock Holmes character. House Holmes, get it. They kind of see the character as sort of abrasive and antisocial and angry. House is an addict. He's addicted to Vicodin, and Benedict Cumberbatch's Sherlock is sort of a high-functioning sociopath, is the way he describes himself. And they're kind of like prickly characters who kind of look down on everyone else. And while those characters are compelling kind of on their own, that's not what the character is like. I think the closest to the books would be Robert Downey Jr.'s version from his two films, which I really genuinely love, and Johnny Lee Miller's Elementary. In that version, he's portrayed as kind of a recovering addict, but he's not like a cruel, angry person. He kind of has his own demons that he's facing, but he's still like a good kind of character who cares about people. And the Robert Downey Jr. version, I think that plays up his sort of neurodivergence, which you can read in the original series, but it's never really explicitly stated because I don't think they had words for it back then. But I think the character is sort of played up as more of a savant in those two in those two movies. But I think they're still really, really good, because the original Sherlock Holmes he's a great character. He's kind of mercurial, and he's sort of unpredictable, but he's polite. He's kind of playful at times. He's a happy person. He's kind to people, especially women. He's really, his whole thing is he really like takes care of the women around him, except for the ones who are out to take him down, of course. But he's not like an angry, like vicious person who looks down on other people. One of my favorite aspects of the character is that he has kind of huge gaps in his education. He sort of hyperfixates on certain topics and becomes like a leading expert on like really specific things, like, cigar ash or something. And then there's other aspects of his education that he just completely ignores because he doesn't think it's important. And so he has like these huge, massive, he's not like a genius who knows everything. He doesn't study anything he doesn't really care about personally. So there's often times when like he's not the most educated person in the room, but he is the cleverest person in the room, and he kind of has to use his wiles to outwit people, and that's just a great thing. I also love his penchant for disguises. The character, there's some versions of Holmes that play up the disguises thing, and there's others that kind of don't. But I love I love his disguises. There's many times in his stories or books where you'll see like a shady character moving in the background, and you have to ask yourself, you're like, is that Holmes in a wig and a cloak, or is that actually someone we should be concerned about? And later on, you'll find out either like, oh, that's this person I was tailing, or that was actually me. Never mind. And it's just great. The character is so much fun. Also, if you think that the Holmes stories are sort of limited to like the Victorian era, I would say there's a lot more. It sort of starts in that era, but the stories go up to 1927. So you see Holmes in like World War One, the beginning of the modernist age. So it's not just kind of the cliche of sort of the the foggy London streets. That's more something you see in the more gothic stories, the Hound of the Baskervilles and all that. But he's a much broader kind of range of stories and settings, and there's a ton of good stuff. Also, the prose, a lot of people think that because it's sort of old-fashioned, the prose is sort of going to be inaccessible and dense, and it really isn't. He's a great writer. There's times when he writes stuff that's good enough that it should be studied in like university courses, but it won't because they dismiss Holmes stories as like lowbrow fiction, which is not right, because this is good stuff. There's good stuff here. But I wanted to read you a little excerpt from his first novel, A Study in Scarlet, and just the way he describes people and settings is just terrific. Looking down on this very scene, there stood upon the 4th of May, 1847, a solitary traveller. His appearance was such that he might have been the very genius or demon of the region, an observer who would have found it difficult to say whether he was nearer to 40 or to 60. His face was lean and haggard, and the brown parchment-like skin was drawn tightly over the projecting bones. His long brown hair and beard were all flecked and dashed with white. His eyes were sunken in his head and burned with an unnatural luster. It's just so great. I love the way that he writes. He describes people with sort of the enthusiasm of like Charles Dickens, but it's not sort of self-indulgent prose. It's very kind of, it pulls you along, and he really genuinely writes exciting stories. Even the stuff that's written in like the 1800s, and you think, oh, well, that's old, and it's probably boring. It's not. It's good, it's compelling, I promise. Give it a chance, you'll like it. One thing I did want to touch on is there's going to be elements in the stories that have not aged well, but unlike other works, I would say there's no hateful intent on the author's part. If there's any kind of old-fashioned depictions of like minorities, it's always because of like societal ignorance, but it's never out of maliciousness. Like Doyle liked writing about like different peoples and different cultures, and he liked showing London as kind of a cosmopolitan space that wasn't just filled with like white English guys. He really enjoyed writing about kind of diverse characters and settings, and sometimes it was Orientalism, and that kind of thing, but he was never sort of demonizing whole groups of people intentionally. There's always kind of shady characters, and sometimes they're not described super well because maybe they're like, an unfair depiction of a minority character. But I would say Doyle was not writing from a place of hate the way someone like, H.P. Lovecraft was sometimes. So if you see stuff like that, I would say just read it and learn from it. See how things have changed since then, see what things haven't changed, learn from it, but don't just dismiss it all because of a few kind of hurtful stereotypes. I know that's very kind of a privileged thing to say, but you can tell in stories when someone writes hateful stereotypes as kind of a malicious act, because it kind of reveals the author's disdain for a group of people. And there's other times where you could see, they don't know about the kind of culture they're describing, and so they resort to stereotypes, and it's more like accidental Orientalism than it is like malicious, hateful writing. So, with that said, there will be stuff like that here and there in the stories, but it's not an excuse to just throw out all of it and just never read any of his works again, because there's so much good stuff in the Holmes stories. And I love that this character has sort of taken on a life of its own, to the point where he sort of exists outside of these original stories. You can enjoy Sherlock Holmes content for years and years and years without ever having to read any of the original books. So, with that said, if you don't want to read them, you don't have to. But I'd say don't give up on the original Holmes works, especially The Hound of the Baskervilles. That's such a masterful, wonderful novel. It's full of gothic atmosphere. It's creepy. It's so good. And I love it so much. So with that said, I will let you go. But if you're looking to sort of enjoy Holmesian stories without actually having to read any of it, if you're like, I'm not much of a reader, which is fine, I would suggest watch the Robert Downey Jr. films, both of them. They're great. The TV show Elementary, really, really good. It changes some things up, but it really captures the heart of the series. The movie Mr. Holmes, starring Ian McKellen as a retired Sherlock Holmes, is so gorgeous. I love that movie so much. And the oft-overlooked Disney classic, The Great Mouse Detective, which kind of features Holmes in the background, but the main character is very much a Holmesian character, and it's just delightful, and it's sort of overlooked because it came out sort of before the Disney Renaissance with like The Little Mermaid. So anyways, get to it, enjoy it, read it, watch it. The character is fun, and I'm glad he's going to be around with us for a while. So with that said, I'll let you go, and I'll see you next week. Bye.